I'll tell you what, chat, if we're going to go back to some US election stuff, you watch James O'Brien failing to understand the American election on LBC. It wouldn't be No Justice MTG covering a large-scale political issue if we didn't use this opportunity to dunk very, very easily on James O'Brien. We cannot miss out on any opportunity to dunk on James O'Brien. Let's have a listen to his longest monologue ever about Donald Trump.
So I've written down 3 words, and I bet you can't, for the life of you, work out why or what links them. I've written down Dixville, Marks, and Mateless. Dixville, Marks, and Mateless. Let's start with Mateless, who did sterling work last night across all manner of platforms.
Citation needed.
But I don't know if you remember, was it a year ago? When Emily went to America to sort of test the waters, when everybody presumed that 2024 would be Biden versus Trump. Emily went to America and sought to establish, the lie of the land, electorally speaking. And I was taken aback, actually. I don't think I conveyed it on air. But I was really surprised by the first thing she said to me, which is that the main topic of conversation, or the thing that people seem to care most about, was the price of petrol, or gasoline, as they call it, at the pumps. Now, that was interesting for a number of reasons, but chiefly because
I can't believe Americans care about the price of something that is incredibly necessary for the basics of transportation. Wow, crazy. People talk about the cost of petrol at the pump in the UK as well. They talk about the cost of car insurance and road tax and what it costs to run your car in general, okay? Having repairs. People care about the cost of living. It's more of an issue specifically around the price of petrol in America because there's no public transport, right? Like, we cared about prices here too. It's just that petrol as a commodity is so central to the American economy that's what cuts through.
For people like me, and possibly you, who presume that little things like trying to launch an insurrection against a democratically elected government, being found by a court essentially to be a rapist, or being a multiple felon, all of these things that I thought, and you possibly thought, or would have thought, would overshadow everything else. I'm fond of the phrase, as you know, personal depravity. The idea that Donald Trump...
I spent so much time during the election period over here as well talking about this during the UK election, about how journalists just have weird priorities, and because of the bubble they live in, like the Fleet Street bubble, they don't know the fact that people actually don't care about what's going on in the background of politics. For the same reasons that people don't care about the January 6th insurrection or Trump's links to Epstein or all of the convictions or anything like that about the internal machinations of politics, is identical to the reasons which people in the UK don't really care about the Tories looking disunited, or the fact that they couldn't have a coherent message to voters about their values, or the fact that Boris Johnson's actions and his unseriousness as a politician was what hurt them, because none of this is true. Journalists care about it, but when it came down to the brass tacks of the election, it was the cost of living and the state of the NHS. These are the two big things. Healthcare policy is important in America too. People were really kind of emboldened by Medicare for all as a policy, and the fact there was no healthcare proper reform policy of Harris's campaign really hurt her. But it was the cost of living as a central issue that people cared about, and they just blamed the incumbent government for both, despite the fact that Biden did more oil drilling, even more. He'd given up on actually having a proper green transition to drill more oil for the sake of gas prices. So. But the things of what's going on behind closed doors in the halls of power, not concern about average Joe on the public who are making snap decisions on voting, in the month before the election and not following every single part of electoral politics every day, like Muggins over here does, or indeed the Muggins on your screen.
Trump's personal depravity would push all other concerns out of the electoral space, out of the political space. I don't care what he says, you would think, about the economy or about immigration or about any of the other issues that purport to be priorities in politics, because his personal depravity is so acute and so obvious that won't matter. So that's
liberal journalists shocked to find out that it was actually about the material conditions all along.
Mistake number one. It is about the price of petrol at the pumps. People are looking at their personal financial situation and believing the man.
What a shocking horror. Shock. Absolutely insane to think that people's material conditions might be the most important thing coming up to an election. mind blown.
Who said he will make it better. What you have in your pocket and the spending power you have in the store is not about GDP. It's partly about inflation. And that's where the first, if you like, a tragedy kicks in that the performance on inflation has been better than most in the world, but not good enough to diffuse the sense across much of America that they are worse off under Joe Biden than they were under Trump.
And the thing is as well is that it didn't matter, really, actually. It didn't really matter who the opposition candidate was, whether it was Trump or Nikki Haley or even if it was Vivek Ramaswamy. It didn't really matter because all you have to do is point the finger and say prices have gone up, it's their fault, and you gain support with people, right? It didn't really matter that Keir Starmer was disliked. He was very, very unpopular in the same way Trump was unpopular. But you could just say crash the economy, material conditions, like they can't be trusted to govern, and then you would maintain a certain level of support whilst the people lost support on the other side. And again, like Trump didn't win people over, he lost votes, whereas the Democrats tanked and lost tens of millions of votes, right? It was the incumbent advantage is lost as soon as material conditions deteriorate.
This notion that liberals I don't think can let go of. I don't think you can say personal depravity doesn't matter. I don't think you can say we need to prepare ourselves for a new political age in which personal depravity doesn't matter. Daniel Finkelstein in the Times today writes quite brilliantly, and he wrote before the results landed, so it gave him a sort of freedom, if you like, to speak without the bias of knowledge. Indeed, he acknowledged this himself. He said, I have an advantage over you. You are reading this knowing at least something of the presidential election result. I am writing before the votes have been counted. It's one of the most acute pieces of political analysis that I think I've ever read. And it runs through all of the things that we have run through on this programme. It points out that he has remained politically viable through a series of quite extraordinary scandals, multiple felonies, found by a court to have raped a woman, disowned by his former vice president and his former national security advisor, called a fascist by his former chief of staff, and described by his former military chief as the most dangerous person ever. So when you get your little pound shop Trumpites in the Conservative Party like Suella Braverman claiming that the nomenclature of fascism, that the accusations of being like Hitler have come from the left, they're lying to you again, just like they did when they told you Liz Truss would be a brilliant prime minister, or when they told you Boris Johnson was an honest man, or when they told you that Brexit would be brilliant. They're lying to you again. The queue of people describing Donald Trump in fascistic and hideous terms consisted largely, for the final months of the campaign, of people who had once been in his inner circle. Not just people who'd once voted for him and regretted it, but people who had once been in his inner circle. His own vice president, his own national security advisor, his own former chief of staff, and his former military chief described him, and I quote, as the most dangerous person ever. And as Daniel Finkelstein writes, barely touches the sides of all the scandals he's been embroiled in and all of the staff members who have sounded the alarm about him. And liberals have to cling to the notion that this matters. You can't let...
Yeah, of course, liberals have to cling to that notion because you have no solutions to people's material conditions because your ideology is dog shit. Literally still just clutching their copies of the end of history tight to their chest going, no, but history has ended. They promised me history would end and the adults would be back in the room and politics would become boring again. Newsflash. That's not happening until you fix people's material conditions. Again, shock horror, James O'Brien has come to the correct conclusion, and it's 7 years late. The worst part about James O'Brien is that I think that a lot of his understandings of politics eventually lead him to the right conclusions. He's always massively fucking late. He's always Captain Hindsight every single time going, oh, well, that actually makes sense when you think about it from this perspective. I'm like, just admit the Marxists were right. Just admit that the Marxists were right. For once in your life, just admit that the liberals got it wrong.
Go of the idea that this stuff doesn't matter just because it seems not to matter to a majority of the American electorate. I think he's probably going to win the popular vote for the first time, looking at how things stand. So that is why I was haunted almost, and conscious perhaps of not having paid as much heed to it at the time as I should have done, of how precise it was of Emily Maitlis to point out, I think a year ago, from America, on a mission to find out how the land lay electorally, that people were really concerned about the price of petrol at the pumps. Isn't that incredible? The second thing I wrote...
Well, it's not incredible because that's, again, material conditions are the thing. it's just not incredible. Oh, God. Oh no. Oh dear. It's going to be a tough one, chat.
But the third element of the conversation is the thing that Simon Marks and I touched upon at the end of yesterday's programme, which was, in many ways, it kind of stayed with me on the way home. I nearly inserted a caveat while we were talking about it, but I didn't, because it was true. And it's the weirdest element, perhaps, of all. So Simon and I yesterday concluded that in many ways, and you need to listen to the end of this, because at first glance it might seem very, very strange. In many ways, the worst thing that could happen in yesterday's election, if you were to step back and try to focus on the biggest picture of all, the worst thing that could happen would be a very narrow victory for Kamala Harris, because that would, as many people feared and predicted, that would propel January the 6th Mark II. That would propel another attempted insurrection, probably it would make the last January the 6th look like a dress rehearsal. And this is the bit I find weirdest. That didn't overcome all of the other issues either. So even that fear, which you talk about now, Simon and I talked about it so casually, so sort of normally. Well, of course, the big fear is that if Kamala Harris wins by a narrow margin, he'll probably attempt another coup, and this time he might succeed. And we talk about that so blithely, so casually. Could you imagine 10 years ago, two relatively qualified or informed commentators or watchers of politics on either side of the Atlantic, could you imagine two people talking about avoiding the possibility of an attempted coup?
I mean, it's hardly out of the question, is it? Happened in Brazil, right? They literally tried to do the same thing when Lula won the election there as well. Like, it's hardly out of the ordinary in basically every other country in the world, you know? Like, these things, unfortunately, are the product of an unstable world. And we have been hurtling towards this position where people were going to get consistently enraged by their political representatives post-2008. The relationship between liberal capitalism and the people that are supposed to benefit from it has been completely severed in a post-2008 world. People went two directions, right? You had your Occupy Wall Streets and you also had your cryptocurrency on the other side, right? There were the hyper-capitalists and the anti-capitalists that were birthed out of 2008, and this is where we were heading up. This is where we were heading in a world where there's this gigantic, this kind of chasm of inequality, when it was the equality of the post-war period that was gained out of the Second World War that really kind of fomented stability in the global north that you don't get in the global south. Now that stability goes away, we are going to look more like the global south. That's going to be what it's going to look like more often now, unfortunately.
Being a very real factor in election analysis. And just casually saying to each other, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? I suppose that's a silver. So we actually said the best result would be a clear victory for either candidate. I don't know that a clear victory, a narrow victory for Trump wouldn't have changed anything. We'd be exactly where we are today. There is no prospect whatsoever of Kamala Harris announcing that she intends to ignore the election result or telling lies about votes. I mean, again, this weird narrative of relating facts in the context of an election result that says these facts don't matter to enough people. This is relatively uncharted territory. Even with Brexit, the realisation that you'd been lied to was on the road ahead.
But every election is like this. What are you talking about? We continually elected the United States presidents after they'd done unspeakable crimes. We elected Margaret Thatcher after she negotiated with the IRA after saying that she didn't. We re-elected Thatcher after she backed up the Khmer Rouge government in exile. We backed Margaret Thatcher after she gave weapons to Islamic extremists who then went on to fund the Taliban. And we never really talk about these things. People have done horrendous stuff over and over and over again. Like, the nature of democracy is like this, unfortunately. Yeah, people were making plenty of claims that would be a military coup if Corbyn won the election.
The naive belief that facts would matter, that they would overcome feelings, that was all on the horizon. You're not going to get richer. There's not going to be 350 million quid for the NHS. They're not going to suddenly start deporting every brown person on the tills in Tesco's. They're not. All of that stuff that propelled Brexit over the line was an extraordinary con trick. But this is all in the rearview mirror, and it doesn't matter. And this is what you have to cling to. It doesn't matter enough It doesn't matter enough. The fact
And now you know why they lost. It's because that's all the messaging. All the messaging was just Trump this, Trump that, January 6th this, January 6th that. What did John Kelly say, etc., etc., etc. And they didn't talk about, bread and butter issues, as the CNN commentator said, about Bernie Sanders messaging about bread and butter issues, which they should have tacked to, and then didn't, after Jonathan Ashworth told them not to go after moderate Republicans.
that he tried to steal the last election. The fact that he was prepared to subvert the entire democratic process up to and including the potential assault upon his own vice president. The disowning of his most senior former colleagues, the condemnation of his former military chief, the use of the F word by his former chief of staff, the condemnation from his own national security advisor. None of it mattered. Brackets enough. And that is why I think we've struggled in the last couple of weeks, whenever we've turned our attention to this American election, to get to the bottom of it. I think we got closest yesterday. I thought that the question of what is it about America that we don't understand was the closest we got to acknowledging that there's something going on that turns a lot of our presumptions upside down. One thing, for example, and this has resonance in some elements of British politics. If you're a second or third generation immigrant in America, you are not going to be necessarily any more casual towards the rhetoric, the anti-immigrant rhetoric of Donald Trump than you are if you can trace your lineage back to the Mayflower. If you are prioritizing your personal financial health over everything else, and someone is telling you that your personal financial health is being compromised by immigration, most obviously illegal, but of course it's always a very, very short hop to legal immigration getting hit with the same attack lines, then you're not going to think, well, my granddad was an immigrant. You're not even going to think my dad was an immigrant. Just look at some of the people who have risen in the Conservative Party in recent years. You're going to think, well, actually, no, they're a threat to me as well.
Well, I mean, I think, fun enough, he is on the money here. Like, he is actually talking sense about why immigration narratives work and how, second and third generation immigrants absolutely buy into it, right? It's not about being the other. It's about being outside the citizen, non-citizen dynamic, right? Like, that's where nationalism comes from. This, how the nation state defines who we should care about. It's the imagined community that binds people together. And this in-group versus out-group, again, that's how conservatism works, by defining these in-groups and out-groups. That's something that you can unify people from plenty of different backgrounds. It's the act of immigration that a lot of them disagree with. So trying to paint a lot of them as racist when they aren't is completely untrue. Obviously, there are plenty of racists who do believe these things, but the immigration rhetoric is powerful with voters, because it creates non-citizens as an other that you can use to scapegoat for the failures of policy.
So those three things, I still can't quite unravel or riddle. So the Dixville thing is easy. That was me naively thinking, oh, well, the game's up. If 3 people can shift out of 6, if 50% of a tiny and probably unrepresentative electorate can make such a huge leap from pro-Biden to pro-Trump, then I think the game is up for Kamala Harris. Mateless telling me a year ago that the priority for many of the people she was talking to was the price of petrol at the pumps. I don't want to describe liberal discombobulations about things like rape and election theft. I don't want to describe that as a luxury. But it's clear that for a majority of the American election, none of this matters enough. It doesn't matter enough. It's dispiriting but grimly predictable that people like Suella Braverman can share their views on this without being asked questions about things like rape and election theft, and can say things about the left describing him as a fascist when in fact it was his own national security advisor. But that's a failure of media in this country that has been in place since long before 2016. But the electorate don't care enough about these things to overshadow or overcome their fears, I think, first about the economy and second about immigration. But I don't think you can separate those two things. If you've seen it happen here. Don't look.
It is literally like watching a dog walk on its hind legs. It's like watching somebody learn how to ride a bike for the first time, understanding the concept of material conditions. I mean, again, I'm glad that he's here. I'm glad that he's here all of these years on about the material conditions being the central theme of political discussion. But the time for this was 7 years ago, not now.
The reason why your financial situation is not as healthy as you would like it to be is because of the people that mow your lawn and deliver your food. It's not because of the people who run the country, or the people that own Twitter, or the people that own Amazon. It's because of him over there delivering your tacos. Little nod to my American listeners there. And that is where I am at 21 minutes after 10 this morning. Very, very simply, none of the stuff matters enough. And that is why, look, Daniel Finkelstein is a conservative.
You don't think you can separate economic and immigration issues? You don't fucking say, James. Well, that's the problem, right? Is that I think that a lot of people in his sphere, in his bubble, tried to paint everybody who had any concerns about immigration as being racist. And I don't think they were. Their concerns about immigration are nonsense, right? Their concerns about immigration are completely made up. They're fabricated. They're not true. They're not actually an accurate representation of the economic impact of migration. That is constantly obscured by a servile media that usually actually does run for racist reasons, right? They do try and capitalize on this sentiment, and of course racists are anti-immigration too, but it's exactly the reasons as to why we got Brexit. It's because they were smeared as being racist when plenty of them just weren't. They just had different opinions on the economy. Again, whether they were wrong or right, that's for the birds. It was the attitudes of the people who derided their opinions as to why they revolted against the political class's consensus that we should just stick with the EU because it's good and we know about it, rather than make any positive cases in response to their economic concerns. Every time, it always comes back to the Eddie Dempsey clip.
As the institutions of the working class and their jobs have been removed from around this country, some of their institutions have been taken over by the Liberals. And that is a problem for us, because I can tell you what, whatever you think about people that turn out for Tommy Robinson demos or any other march like that, the one thing that unites them people, beyond whatever other bigotry that's going on, is their hatred of the Liberal left. And they are right to hate them. They are correct. Because they are the people who have seen their industries taken away, who have captured their Labour Party, and are now talking to them like they're the scum of the earth. There's too many in the Labour Party right now. They've made a calculation that there's a certain section of the top end of the working class in alliance with people they calculate from ethnic minorities and the Liberals. That's enough to get them into power. And they believe that alliance is all they need, that they can disregard all of the working class people in this country that have been driven away from the Labour movement by the neoliberals over the years. I'll tell you what, they do so at their peril. Because if we don't have the left organising and representing the working class in this country, then it's a dangerous day when somebody else does.
The Democrats did it exactly the same. Talk about concerns over, what's happening in politics. Talk about concerns over racist rhetoric and ignore the plight of the poorest in society from people who've seen their communities destroyed by neoliberalism. They ran on that platform in the last election and they lost because the thing that unites them is they just don't like liberals. It's especially galling when liberals in the United States have all of these chops of being people who are inclusive, and they just aren't, because they disregard people who disagree with them on basic stuff. Completely disregard them. Especially at the same time as being a political party that is completely intertwined with the corporate class that is the root of all of the problems that are being faced by working class people in the year of our Lord 2024, as has been the case since the inception of capitalism.
The point he makes is, I think, inarguable. An alarming number of people don't care at all about liberal democratic norms, as long as things are all right for them.
How do you think countries like the Soviet Union or Pinochet's Chile managed to stay together for so long? It's because they fundamentally had to deal with one thing, which was people's material conditions. There wasn't enough poor people that were absolutely destroyed by the Pinochet administration to outnumber the middle-class people that he benefited. There wasn't enough middle-class people, especially under communism, to outdo the people who fully supported the cause of the Bolsheviks and the stateless, classless, moneyless society that was at the end of communist thought at that period, at that time period. And it was the deterioration of material conditions under the communist and the fascist states where liberal democracy had been abandoned that also caused the decline of those particular modes of governance as well. The Yugoslav wars were a function of deteriorating material conditions because nationalist sentiment had increased with the failure of Yugoslav economic policy because of the oil shocks of the 70s and the IMF loans of the 80s, and the Soviet Union collapsed because of failures on the economy as well. Because the collapse in material conditions will cause a new order to be born, either liberal democracy from authoritarianism or authoritarianism out of the collapse of liberal democracy. Because again, it's the material conditions.
Or as long as they think that the person trashing liberal democratic norms is going to be good for them, has their interests at heart. Whether that's true or not is immaterial. It's moot, isn't it? I'll read that to you again. An alarming number of people don't care at all about liberal democratic norms as long as things are all right for them. And they rather think, quotes, strongman, end quotes, rule. Personal note, the weirdest thing about Donald Trump support is the notion that he's some sort of strongman when he's an incredibly thin-skinned man-child. But maybe all strongmen through history were. They just had good PR. They think that this strongman rule might be better than rule by a load of squabbling politicians. They like that Trump, or they believe that Trump is a successful and ruthless businessman. They like that he belittles other people. They think he's doing it on their behalf. And I won't share with you yet Finkelstein's evidence that this applies in the UK as well, because I need to get a...
And the thing is, there is another version of authoritarian governance that doesn't do this, right? Gonna go back to my boy, my guy, my home slice, Tito. Whilst he may have been questionable on his approach to people who opposed him politically, the one thing that was central to the Tito project in Yugoslavia was brotherhood and unity. It was bringing people together. It was uniting the country of different nationalities and different languages and different backgrounds. And it was successful. It was successful in creating the multicultural society that Yugoslavia was until he died and the economy tanked afterwards as well. And people's material conditions started to depreciate before the Yugoslav wars took hold, right? But they loved him because he loved them. He was a strong man, but he loved his country and he loved his people regardless of background. He didn't pit nationality against nationality and make sure that that was the people who would be part of his supporter base as a strong man. I mean, you don't have to have fascist strongman, just a thought. But not to say, personally, I think a strongman is a good thing. I have a utilitarian case for democracy being a good thing, and I support it. I'm a democratic socialist fundamentally. Fundamentally, I believe in democracy underpinning the popular governance of socialism. But, I also understand why people will turn towards strongmen in times of upheaval, especially when the democracy that is claimed to be upheld by liberalism is actually functionally not really a democracy. It's not really a democracy, is it? Because it's entirely influenced by the corporate capture that people have now revolted against in a post-2008 world. They hate corporations, left and right. All of us hate corporations, with good reason, of course. And these people have bought out our democracy. I'm going to go back to the Lenin quote that I always do every single time, right? Democracy for the very rich, for the insignificant minority. That is democracy under capitalism. Democracy for the very rich. Because it's true. And unless you can make democracy work for people, rather than for elites, for oligarchs, there will still be discontentment with it.
A phone in up and running. Well, I think I do. You know me. It's one of those days. I'd quite happily talk uninterrupted until 12 noon today, but I don't know that that's necessarily what you've tuned in for. Some of you tell me that you have, and that's very kind, but we need to puzzle this stuff together. So I don't think you can argue with that conclusion. An alarming number of people, enough people to elect a president, don't care at all about liberal democratic norms, as long as, and then you can insert whatever sentence you want here to take you back to where this introduction began, as long as it brings down the price of petrol, as long as it improves my spending power in Walmart, as long as it makes me feel better about myself. An alarming number of people, a majority probably of the popular vote in America, do not care at all about liberal democratic norms, as long as things are all right for them. Remember, this article, which I heartily recommend, was written before the results came in. I'll give you one statistic. This is from a bit of polling that was done for a British think tank. Support for a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections was at 46%. So we're living in a world where enough people to deliver election victories do not care, actively reject liberal democratic norms. Eleanor's just written the word time in 6-inch high letters on the screen in front of me, which I think is a fair comment. Time, gentlemen, please. So what do we do about that? What do we do about that? If you don't...
Literally get corporations and the rich people out of our fucking democracy. We have an entire political consensus that is that corporations must be pandered to all the time and that you cannot inconvenience the rich. And they are warping our politics. They have taken over the Labour Party. Private equity is funding our fucking government. The easiest thing is to get rid of corporate control of democracy. And they won't do it because they're already bought out. They're already subservient. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.